August 1st, 2024, marked a day of reckoning in Nigeria. Citizens took to the streets, their voices a chorus of anger and frustration. The reason? Economic hardship had reached a breaking point. Inflation had soared, eating away at meager savings. The cost of basic necessities had become unbearable. Unemployment was rampant, leaving many struggling to feed their families. For years, Nigerians had endured these conditions. They had hoped for change, for policies that would ease their burdens. But their hopes were dashed time and again. The government's economic policies, they felt, were inadequate at best and detrimental at worst. The gap between the rich and the poor widened, while the middle class struggled to stay afloat. The protests were a culmination of this simmering discontent. They were a desperate plea for help, a cry for the government to acknowledge their suffering. Nigerians from all walks of life united in their demand for a better future. They demanded jobs, affordable food, and a chance to live with dignity. The government's response to the protests was swift and harsh. Over 100 people were arrested, including young people and even minors. 10 of them faced charges of treason, a crime punishable by death in Nigeria. This heavy-handed approach sent shockwaves through the nation and drew condemnation from international human rights organizations. Critics accused the government of attempting to silence dissent. They argued that the arrests were a blatant violation of the right to peaceful assembly and freedom of expression. The government, they claimed, was more interested in protecting its own power than in addressing the concerns of its citizens. Human Rights Watch, among other organizations, called for the immediate release of all those detained. They urged the government to drop the treason charges and engage in a meaningful dialogue with the protesters. The international community watched closely, urging restraint and a return to the rule of law. Despite the government's attempts at suppression, the August protests revealed a powerful undercurrent in Nigerian society unity. In a country often divided along religious and ethnic lines, the protests saw Nigerians standing shoulder to shoulder. Muslims and Christians, Hausas and Igbos, Yorubas and Ijaws, all united in their shared struggle. This unity was a testament to the severity of the economic crisis and the collective frustration it had engendered. It demonstrated that when faced with a common enemy, Nigerians could overcome their differences and fight for a common cause. The protests became a symbol of hope, a sign that change might be possible. The protests in Nigeria did not occur in isolation. Across the African continent, similar scenes of unrest were unfolding. In Kenya and Uganda, citizens were also taking to the streets, driven by the same frustrations: economic hardship, government corruption, and a lack of opportunities. Analysts drew parallels between these protests and the Arab Spring uprisings of 2010. Like the Arab Spring, the African protests were fueled by a youthful population, disillusioned with the status quo and empowered by social media. The use of platforms like Twitter and Facebook allowed protesters to organize, share information, and amplify their message. However, it's important to avoid simplistic comparisons. Every country has its own unique history, context, and set of challenges. While the protests across Africa shared some commonalities, they were also driven by local grievances and should be understood within their specific national contexts. The August 2024 protests in Nigeria were a stark reminder of the urgent need for change. They exposed the deep-seated economic inequalities and the government's failure to address them. The protests were a wake-up call, not just for Nigeria, but for the entire African continent. To prevent further unrest, governments across Africa must prioritize good governance, transparency, and accountability. They must invest in education, healthcare, and job creation, particularly for the burgeoning youth population. Failure to address these issues will only breed further discontent and instability. The protests, while met with brute force, offered a glimmer of hope. They showed the power of collective action and the potential for change when people unite for a common cause. It is now up to the government to heed the people's demands and work towards a more just and equitable future for all Nigerians. The urgency for change has never been clearer. The voices of the people resonating through the streets and social media call for immediate and meaningful reforms. It's a call to action that cannot be ignored. Governments must listen, engage, and act with integrity and compassion. This is a pivotal moment, and the choices made now will shape the future of nations and generations to come. The time for change is now, and it is everyone's responsibility to contribute to a brighter, more just future.